We're going to move along here to Dr. Young, who will discuss the AOA SAT.
Yes, thank you, Sam. Sarah and Erica both teed me up great earlier, so thanks to them for that. I will be discussing the analog objectives for Artemis Specific Action Team. This was requested and sponsored by the PSD and within the Science Mission Directorate, and it was also sponsored by League. So thanks to those organizations for that. And then while I have the sort of team members up here on the screen, I want to thank each and every one of them for their hard work. This was a really quick turnaround SAT. We did this all in December and January, and everybody worked really hard to make that a reality and get it turned in on time. So thanks to the team for that. Next chart, please, Brad. So why the AOA SAT? Well, NASA wanted to capture and just describe and explain Artemis relevant analog testing objectives. And the real motivation for this was to provide oversight and strategic coordination for analog activities. I think there's been kind of allusions to just a number of different organizations that fund and execute analog work even today in a meeting that's not focused on that. And previous LSSW sessions have talked in more detail about all of the analog work going on. We have really great work from PSTAR, SSW, SURVey. We have the more integrated NASA analog missions, and that's just to name a couple organizations that fund and execute fieldwork. So this SAT is intended to be a resource for all of those stakeholder communities, as well as the lunar science community, to make sure that there's some sort of strategic coordination amongst all of those analog activities that hope to be relevant to Artemis surface missions. So our objective was to catalog and even prioritize the objectives for science and science operations in order to prepare us as a community for Artemis crewed surface missions. Next chart, please, Brad. So what is the format? This report is quite too lengthy to go into any great detail on it, but I want to set you guys up in case you're interested in diving in. So not only does this SAT define objectives for analog testing, again, in order to support crewed lunar surface missions, but it also touches on the following three things for each of these objectives. One is priority. So is the specific objective mission required, mission enabling, or mission enhancing? And we touch on all of those things for both sortie missions, so the shorter duration missions, and Artemis Base Camp missions, which, as you've heard today, are the longer duration, more integrated surface missions. We touch on time criticality, which means is that specific objective required for the very first crewed Artemis surface mission, for additional shorter term Artemis sortie missions, and then is it required for these longer duration base camp missions? And then finally, for each objective, we touch on candidate analog scenarios. Now, these are recommendations for specific hardware, software, facility, amount of personnel, expertise of personnel, et cetera, that we as a team felt were needed to achieve the stated objective. Now, we suggest these scenarios, but we do not require them for any team that hopes to address these objectives. They can choose their own methods for addressing those objectives in their studies. These are just recommendations from the SAT team. Next chart, please. So the objectives that we came up with as a team are categorized into the following sort of categories of objectives. We've heard about a lot of these things, not only today, but specifically at other LSSWs and also upcoming LSSWs that we have as well. We have the science support room. We have the software necessary to support those operations real time. We have instrumentation. We've heard a lot about payloads and instrumentation today. Humans and robotic partnerships, that's really important. We heard several of our speakers mention that earlier. The Lunar South Pole brings with it a complex lighting environment, and learning how to operate and do science in that environment is quite a challenge. We touch on imaging and sampling, as well as managing not only tools, but also samples and other payloads. We talk about the documentation that kind of underpins all of these science and science operations questions. We had a question in the chat earlier today about advanced technologies. This is obviously an open-ended question because technology continues to develop, but we touch on the incorporation of that into science operations. We touch on the communications architecture necessary to support the integration of a science team into the broader mission control structure. We touch on the degree of crew autonomy that we expect across the portfolio of Artemis missions. We talk about the utility of analogs in training, not just crews, but the operations workforce as well. That includes the science community. Obviously, locating exactly where the crew is on the lunar surface and even navigating, again, in that complex lighting environment is a challenge. There's a lot that analogs could do there. And then specifically, we talk about the design of analog missions, and how they could be designed to support the rest of these objectives. Next chart, please. To give you an example, I just included a specific objective here to give you a sense for what the report looks like. This is an objective that just so happens to be in the software section. So this specific objective is determine the requirements for, develop, or assess existing software solutions that support real-time science operations. So each objective in the AOA SAT report will include a longer description of why that objective is there, and again, touch on those 3 variables that we were requested to talk about, which are priority, time criticality, and our recommendations for how to close and address those objectives. So if you'll dive into all those objectives in the report, and each of those will be supported by this text. Next chart, please. Okay, so to wrap up, the AOA SAT report is intended to capture really high priority objectives. We specifically tackle solar system science, not human health and performance, and other science objectives, and it's intended to be a resource for you, the community, hoping to conduct Artemis relevant analog research. So happy reading, and I'll put the link to the report in the chat. Thanks.
Okay, great. Thank you, Kelsey.